A few weeks back, HoustonPBS aired The Strange Demise of Jim Crow, a look at the local heroes of Houston's civil rights movement and how they put into motion the events that desegregated our city. Tonight, we'll continue the conversation and take a look back at Jim Crow laws, where they came from, what was their impact, what led to their demise, and how we understand them today. I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. Joining us tonight are Dr. Alexander Byrd, Associate Professor of History, Rice University; Merline Pitre, Texas Southern University; and Dr. Christine LeVeaux-Haley, Political Science Professor and Interim Dean for Academic Programs at the Honors College, University of Houston. Welcome to you all. Thank you. I think the best place to start is to understand where this term Jim Crow came from. If I could start with you, Christine, on that.
Jim Crow, and it's funny because students often think that there's some man that but Jim Crow was actually a character that was created by a minstrel performer. He was so popular that this character was so popular that literally hundreds of minstrel performers began to use the Jim Crow character in their performances.
And we're talking early
1830s.
1830s.
So well before Jim Crow as we know it in terms of legalized segregation.
And the Jim Crow laws, let me go to Dr. Byrd on this. The Jim Crow laws were enacted and then dissolved, or were Jim Crow laws more of a concept?
Well, they evolve. They're a concept that evolves in the post-slavery period when whites and blacks in the South are working out how they're going to live together in this new society. So exactly immediately following the Civil War, there's a great deal of fluidity, social fluidity. But as white Democrats begin to reassert their social and political power, you get the codification of that power within laws that are demanding certain types of separation between the races.
And Merline, when you hear the term Jim Crow, what does that conjure up for you?
It conjures up a physical separation of the races, but it also conjures up the fact that Jim Crow was spatial. Jim Crow was Jim Crow entailed a restriction on economic, political, and social equality. It also conjured up the image of humiliation. It conjured up the image of inferior race, superior race, and the physical separation of the races as a result of that.
Okay, so in conversation, let's all go back to the Civil War has come to an end. Slavery has been outlawed. What happens then? And the reason I present it this way is, as I understand, initially people start reacting the way people react, but laws had to be enacted to create this separation, correct?
Absolutely. So basically, directly after the Civil War, there was kind of de facto Jim Crow or segregation, but it really wasn't until after the compromise of 1877 when the federal government actually kind of left the South to its own devices. So we have Reconstruction, and then we have the radical Reconstruction, which is when the federal government came in and said, we need to basically handle this process. And that's when we saw the real action in terms of the Freedmen's Bureau and really helping former slaves achieve this liberty. But after the federal government left the South, that's when we began to see the South kind of put things back in place, if you will. Okay, so back to white rule, and that's when we began to see the more legalized separation of the races.
But prior to that, you have to keep in mind that you had Jim Crow by custom prior to the fact that Jim Crow was legalized after the period in which she spoke of. Therefore, if you look at Southern society was perceived as an organic whole, where everybody and everything had a function and a place. And the place for African American was at the bottom. That's why the word place is very important as we look at the history of Jim Crow and segregation, because during slavery he had a place. Even though there was close intimacy or close contact between them, slave had a certain place. And after the Civil War, it still remained in the psychic of most whites. And therefore, it is not until after troops are withdrawn from the South that it comes out, and enforcement of it comes out more than at other time.
So help me understand this then. So there is an understanding that this group of folks are slaves, have been slaves, so they have been put in a status, and they're at the bottom of the rung. Mm-hmm. And it goes away, and then as we start to move forward in the late 1800s and start to become more industrialized, is it because of a dislike, fear, misunderstanding of this class of people, or is it a business decision? Is it, as we hear stories throughout the history of man, the boss keeping his workers down so he can get the cheap labor he needs to survive? But which caused this?
Number one, it didn't go away. When blacks were freed, they were excluded. They were excluded from hospital. They were excluded. The term segregation was never used. And when the radicals came to power, then they appealed some of those laws or those customs. It was more or less custom. And then after troops are left in the South, then there's a new generation of African Americans who are more assertive, and therefore white Southerners saw segregation as a means of controlling the race problem, and therefore begin to assert themselves. When does it
become, you use the term the race problem, mm-hmm. When do we start incorporating that concept of, I mean, I can see and granted, I'm not from the South, so a lot of this history we didn't grow up with out north, but the understanding that these are the slaves, they are the working people that have worked on our plantations and all of that. But when does there become that separation in mindset of inferiority as far as walking into a restaurant, coming into a store, drinking from a water fountain? When does that become a concept?
Let me say specifically, I think you're trying to, so the specific answer to that is that there was the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and that was the act that basically said that beyond the political rights of these newly freed men, we're going to now secure their rights in public accommodations. The Civil Rights Act that was very contested within Congress, but it did pass. It was actually invalidated in 1883 by the Supreme Court, and that is when we began to see states actually put into law. Mississippi in 1890 actually put into their constitution disenfranchisement laws. Other states like Louisiana, most of the southern states, had some type of basic Jim Crow laws or segregation laws put on their books. And that was after...
there might not be an answer to this question, but I'll try it one more time. At what point does it become, or the motivation behind it, is it fear? Is it commerce? What is the motivation behind enacting laws?
One of the primary motivations is political. And so when Dr. Pitre says there's a problem that needs to be solved, one of the problems that needs to be solved is black political and social power. So in the period of radical Reconstruction, from the perspective of the racist South, you have former slaves who are exercising a not insignificant amount of political power. So when the U.S. government begins to withdraw from its enforcement responsibilities of the Reconstruction amendments in the South, Jim Crow, as far as the racist South is concerned, is a solution to black political power. It's designed in many ways to dismantle black political power and social power that was built up in the Reconstruction period.
And also, you have to keep in mind that at the end of the Civil War, you had a disruption of the social order. You had the former slaves and former slave masters supposedly on the same plane. But you have to keep in mind the psychic of white Southerners. White Southerners believed that they should be on top, that white supremacy must attain. And so while federal troops are there, it goes a little smoother. But by the time federal troops are withdrawn from the South, and you have a generation of younger blacks who were never enslaved, who begin to assert themselves, then there is fear on the part of white Southerners that these people may take over, that they are roaming the street, all kind of fear. So in order to minimize that fear, they maximize that control by passing those various laws.
While all this is going on, we're talking about the South. What's going on in the North?
Well, the North is no longer, the newspapers are no longer particularly looking at the South and criticizing the South as much, because now you have a compromise and you have what is known as home rule in the South. So the North is pushing toward industrialization, toward big business, and they are not that interested in race relation. The South is going to drive race relation until the Civil War.
Okay, tell me a little bit then, when we talk about Jim Crow laws, what are these exact laws saying? What are the statements that are in there that must be abided by?
Well, if you look at some of the laws, for example, the first laws would be the ones that would legalize Jim Crow in the transportation industry. For example, that is going to come in 1881. In 1881, the fact that blacks and white are riding in the same car mean that this is contested terrain. Many whites have problems with blacks being that close to whites. Many of the educated blacks have problems too. They're also concerned with the separation, but they can go to a black business, they can go, but if they are to go on transportation, they have to ride in this car, and they want to ride first class. And so therefore, the laws pertaining to the railroad industry are the first one that come about. Now, the first one came about in 1881 in Tennessee because many blacks had filed suit and had won because they bought a first-class ticket and they were denied. So the railroad industry decided they're going to have two. But they say we're going to have a separate one, and if blacks so desire, they can. But by the time other states heard of this, the Civil Rights Act of 1883 the Supreme Court had declared the Civil Rights Act of 1883 unconstitutional. So therefore, they began to pass laws which specifically say that you should have separate courts for Negro and white.
So when does separate but equal become a legal statement in this country?
But the 1880s, during the 1880s.
So it is a policy that is upheld by the Supreme Court. Separate equal is fine.
Separate equal, Plessy versus Ferguson.
So how do we qualify what is equal? Because history tells us that there was not equal in this separate. But how did it get justified at the point? How were they saying was equal for the freeman now less than what is equal for the white man?
No, most of the laws said that you should have equal comfort on the railroad cars. You should have everything that's equal. But who was enforcing the laws?
Right. Dr. Byrd?
I was just going to say, in practice, there's a disconnect between the argument that the majority of the Supreme Court was making and how those laws were applied in the South. And the South understood those laws as a retreat of the federal government from their affairs, and they proceeded accordingly.
So if, in fact, a lot of what we're hearing and we're talking about are these Jim Crow laws, which are primarily in the South, correct?
Correct.
Then do we see a different experience for the northern African Americans? For the northern blacks, are they having a different experience? And if so, looking all the way up to today then, has that minority evolved differently depending on what their background was?
Well, I think it's...
If you understand the question.
I understand the question. It's complex. And so, and people understood the difference at the time. So someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, when he would compare black education in the South with black education in the North, with the understanding that black education in the South was defined by Jim Crow laws and segregation, nevertheless made the argument that it was impossible to really to take that difference and to make any flat and simple judgments from it, that therefore schools for blacks in the South were worse because of segregation than schools for South in the North with the general lack of segregation. His argument is that you really had to look at specific situations. So he wouldn't, one of his phrases that he wouldn't trade the black segregated schools of Baltimore for the integrated schools of Manhattan for much, right?
Yeah.
He would much prefer those schools, but there were segregated. But most segregated schools weren't the segregated schools of Baltimore.
I'm going to ask this question, and I worry that it'll come out sounding wrong, so bear with me in what I'm trying to say here. When you look back and you do the research and you watch the old videos or you see the old photos of this time, the old films, not videos, there are many examples of African American folks who look like white folks. And by that I mean they are dressed in the same clothing. They are not the image we have that's often projected of the African American in the South in the late 1800s. There is a much more polished look. Is there a conscientious effort to promote the look of the less than black person to the general public? Is this something that is consciously done by the white majority to create a particular image, if you're following where I'm going, as opposed to the image that was out there most of the time during that period of the more savage-looking, uneducated problem people? Why did one image prevail over another?
I don't necessarily think it prevailed, because you had the one drop of black blood law, which say that if you have one drop of blood, if you're African American or you have one drop of African American blood, you're black. And so therefore you will find that many of those people who were riding those trains were dressed well, they look well, they look almost white, but they were thrown off the train if they knew that they were black.
But and not even talking about color of skin. I'm talking about presentationally. And you say they looked like whites. You see pictures of many of the black leaders from that time, and they are dressed, I hate to use the word properly, but of a certain social status.
Well, they're just like middle-class folk.
Right.
And
why isn't that the image that prevailed during that time?
That was the exception. I mean, we have to be honest here. I mean, that was the exception. There were blacks who were doing well and who were very educated and middle class, but that was not the rule at that time. And we could talk about now, but that was not the rule. So I think that without making it more than it is, the images that we oftentimes see are they're part of our reality in terms of our history. Those images that you see of people well dressed, that was also the reality for some, but not for the masses.
Okay, take me through
the struggle for first class tickets on rail trains is a middle class struggle.
Right.
It is.
You've got to be able to afford the first class ticket to want to fight for the first class ticket. It's not unrelated to broader civil rights struggles, but when it's happening, it's not the farmer who's struggling to ride in the first class train. It's not the sharecropper who's fighting for that right.
There was a question we talked a little bit about before we started taping today, where I said, if when slavery had ended, that the African American was brought in on the same playing field as the white children and were allowed the same opportunities, could go to the same schools, so on and so forth, even if it was according to socioeconomic level, but it was still treated the same, that in a couple generations everything would have been homogenized to a certain degree. And you didn't follow that same school of thought with me.
Well, the reason I didn't follow it is because I think history really matters, and the history of slavery matters. So I see it as a counterfactual that is difficult for me to get my head around, because the caste system, caste in quotation, that we see that Jim Crow is working to define is in place in the period of slavery. That people, white folks, understand in the period of slavery that black people aren't equal to them, and they don't need Jim Crow laws to understand that. And so that's why I see it as a impossibility in the aftermath of slavery as it was practiced in the American South.
All of this and this history that we talk about, how does it affect what's happening today, do you feel? And I'll start with Dr. LeVeaux-Haley.
Okay, that's a huge question. How does, and controversial as well. Some people want to say that what's happening today is not affected, but I think it's absolutely affected. I think one of the two main thrusts of Jim Crow were political rights, voting rights, and education. And so if we just focus on those two in terms of really segregating and discriminating against blacks as a race, we can see all sorts of effects of that even today in terms of voting. When you read about Jim Crow and the measures that were taken in the brutality against blacks because they wanted to vote, or because they wanted to go to school, there's definitely still an effect of that, and it's hard to it's indirect and it's hard to kind of put it in its place, but we do have to look at the effect of that. I went to a talk with John Hope Franklin was speaking, and he said, the girls in my family went to school. The boys didn't go to school in my family. Well, what effect does that have? And he actually spoke about that. He was talking about boys in education, and what effect does that have on the boys even of this generation.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think we see that. Also, I just wanted to mention that when we talk about Jim Crow and separating the races in education, it's interesting because we've had all sorts of ways that we've tried to address this. White flight has been something that has come out of the desegregation of the schools. And it's interesting to see that, white flight, we can't really, at this point, they tried busing and that kind of thing. At this point, it seems that we are comfortable with the situation the way it is in terms of schools. But if you look at HISD, which is one of the largest districts in the nation, of course the largest in Texas, the percentage of white students in HISD is under 8%. So there are effects. We're still seeing those effects. Do we want the state to actually have this active role in that anymore? That's a question that we need to ask.
I got the feeling you had something to add.
Well, I'll just piggyback on schools. One of the things that I think was interesting about Jim Crow is that some of the most effective Jim Crow laws were effectively colorblind. They didn't necessarily mention race, but they were applied in ways that hurt blacks more than whites. And so I think, and I'm interested in current day education, what our faculties look like in public schools. I think we've achieved a sort of level of comfort of having majority black and Hispanic high schools and a few mixed high schools in Houston just because that's what the school-age population of the city looks like. But I think when you look at the faculty at these schools and the percentages of blacks and whites in different schools, I find that interesting. The high school I went to has a 85% black faculty right now. It's probably a 95% black student body. And I find that interesting because I wonder why it's that high still. It wasn't always that high. It probably wasn't that high in the 70s and the early 80s, but it is that high now. And some of the mixed schools look that way similar. I mean, we have schools, I'll name Bel Air is about a 70% white faculty. It's amazing to me how you can maintain a faculty that looks like that in a district that looks like this at a particular school. Those things, I think, warrant further investigation.
I do want to jump in and say here that as we've talked about this topic too, and you bring up a good point that we kind of glossed over, is that there was a lot of violence tied to these laws. These aren't just laws that were in the books and people felt unfairly treated. There was the term lynching comes up during this period in our history, and there's a lot of violence associated with this. So it's not just don't do that. It's you do that, or even the presumption you might do that can lead to your death. And it was a very horrible period in our history, too. I don't want us to gloss over it at all. Dr. Pitre, what does this give you? Hope for the future? Concern? Where do you fall in all of this today?
I think we have come a long ways, but we have a long ways to go. To piggyback on what she said about education, now you've seen in a number of large cities resegregation of school. If you look at Texas Southern, it was born during the era of Jim Crow, at which time the state said that the university could have any course on demand. They could offer this course, and they could have anything they wanted. But as soon as Sweat was admitted to the University of Texas, the budget was slashed. And for many years, TSU were underfunded. Some amends have been made over years, but what do you do about all of those other years? Mm-hmm. So I think we have a long ways to go, and probably through more education and program like this, we can make some more progress, because my contention is that historical ignorance begets racial ignorance.
Now, do we feel that students today understand when you make the terminology of Jim Crow that they understand the history of it?
My students don't. Initially, thankfully, it keeps me employed. But, they ask, after a lecture on lynching maybe 2 years ago, one of my students, and I thought it was a great lecture, but at the end of about an hour, one of my students raised their hand and said, Dr. Byrd, why did they do that? And it occurred to me that the context is so shifted. I had taught them almost everything I knew about lynching, but they didn't understand white supremacy in the way that they needed to in order to understand lynching.
And in a closing statement, I would say even understanding that, I would still ask why. Understanding all the history we do, why. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming in and joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Simply click on the local program bar, pick Houston 8, and you can join our online community. You can read about the guests, learn more about the topic, and even watch past episodes. Now, programming note, Monday night, The American Experience on Houston PBS will be airing Freedom Riders, a documentary exploring how a group of students set out to change the status quo in the South and ended up changing a nation. Then next Friday night here on Houston 8, our panel will be made up of actual Freedom Riders who fought for change in our country. If you have a question or comment you would like to share on this topic, feel free to email us at houston8@houstonpbs.org. And that does it for us tonight. Next time, I'm Ernie Manous. Have a great week. Thank you for joining us.